The desert stretched endlessly, a vast sea of heat and dust. Inside a column of Italian M13-40 tanks, engines growled beneath the metal hulls, each machine shimmering in the mirage. The crews, drenched in sweat, stared ahead through narrow slits of vision. The sun punished both man and machine. Then, through the haze, movement, shapes, distant but unmistakable, rolling over the dunes. At first, they looked like the British Grants they'd faced before. But as the silhouettes grew larger, the Italian commanders froze. These were new, taller, broader, heavier. Their turrets turned smoothly, like predators testing their aim. The order to fire came too late. The first shells from the American M4 Shermans slammed into the Italian line, the impact echoing across the desert like thunder. Italian rounds bounced harmlessly off the Sherman's sloped armor, sparks and dust scattering in the air. Within minutes, the sand was littered with burning wrecks. Crews scrambled from their tanks, faces blackened with oil and despair. One of them whispered, "It's useless. They don't even feel our shots." It was in this moment, beneath the North African sun, that Italian tankers understood the bitter truth. Their war machines were obsolete. To understand how Italian crews reached that fatal moment in the desert, we must return to the years before the war, to a time when Italy believed it could forge a new empire through steel and ambition. In the early 1930s, Benito Mussolini promised that Italy would stand alongside Germany and Britain as a modern power. The fascist regime poured propaganda into the idea of a reborn Roman Empire, one carried not by legions, but by tanks. Yet, behind the grand speeches, Italy's industrial reality was fragile. The nation's factories lacked both the raw materials and the machinery to produce heavy armor in numbers. Early Italian tanks, like the Carro Veloce L333 and L335, were little more than machine gun carriers, thinly armored, open-topped, and unable to stand against true tanks. They were designed not for duels, but for colonial policing. Against tribal forces in Ethiopia or lightly armed militias in Spain, they seemed impressive. But this illusion would cost dearly once Italy entered a real mechanized war. By the late 1930s, Italian engineers produced their first medium tank, the M1139, followed soon after by the M1340 and M1441. They looked formidable on parade. Riveted armor plates, long guns and boxy silhouettes rolling through Rome as Mussolini saluted from the balcony. But appearances deceived. The armor was thin, the guns outdated, and the engines weak under desert conditions. When Italy joined Germany's war in June 1940, the armored divisions that rolled into Libya were already obsolete. The desert was unforgiving. Sand-clogged filters, overheated engines seized, and fuel was perpetually scarce. Italian mechanics improvised endlessly, using rags as filters and stripped parts from wrecks just to keep tanks moving. Despite these hardships, Italian tankers fought with determination. They engaged British Matildas and Crusaders across the Libyan sands, often outgunned and outmaneuvered. During early clashes like Sidi Barrani, 1940, and Operation Compass, 1940-41, Italian armor suffered catastrophic losses. Entire divisions, such as the 10th Army, were crushed by superior British mobility and tactics. The Germans soon intervened. When Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps arrived in 1941, they brought not just reinforcement, but a lesson in modern warfare. The Germans introduced combined arms tactics, efficient communication, and mechanical discipline that the Italians had never practiced. Italian crews admired their allies, but quietly knew the gap was vast. Rome tried to improve the situation. Orders were placed for heavier models, the P-2640, a tank roughly comparable to the Sherman, but it wouldn't reach production until the war was nearly over. Meanwhile, the The same outdated M13s and M14s kept rolling into battle. By late 1941, Italy's armored doctrine was already failing. Their tanks had no radios. Commanders used flags or shouted through open hatches to coordinate maneuvers. Armor-piercing shells were scarce. Many tanks still carried solid shot rounds from the 1930s that could barely scratch modern British armor. Still, the Italian high command persisted under the illusion of parity. Mussolini's speeches claimed that Italian courage would balance German technology and Anglo-American industry. But on the battlefield, courage could not deflect 75mm shells. In the sand-blasted wastes between Tobruk and El Alamein, Italian crews fought in machines that rattled apart under their own recoil. For every German Panzer III or IV, there were multiple Italian M13s, slower, noisier, and far more vulnerable, and yet they stayed in the fight, out of duty, out of pride, and out of a hope that perhaps, one day, Rome would deliver something better. But instead of better tanks, what came next was worse news. The United States had entered the war. Fresh, modern, and industrially unstoppable, America's entry meant a new kind of armored warfare. The U.S. Army's M3 Grant and later M4 Sherman would redefine the desert battlefield. By early 1942, reports filtered through Axis lines of tanks that could climb dunes with ease, fire on the move, and withstand multiple hits without breaking. Italian crews dismissed them as exaggerations. They would soon see for themselves. The desert was about to become a proving ground, one where outdated dreams of empire would meet the cold precision of American engineering. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the balance of industrial power shifted overnight. Within months, American factories were producing tanks faster than the Axis could destroy them. Convoys loaded with steel and machinery crossed the Atlantic, bound for Egypt and the British Eighth Army. Among the shipments were the first M3 Grants, tall, ungainly tanks armed with a 75mm gun mounted in the hull and a 37mm gun in the turret. To the Italians, still operating M1340s and M1441s, the Grant looked monstrous. Its firepower was unmatched in North Africa at the time. Even the Germans took notice. Yet what truly alarmed the Italian tankers wasn't the gun. It was the realization that American production could replace every lost vehicle, while Italy struggled to replace a single one. By early 1942, the North African campaign had become a desperate contest of endurance. Rommel's Africa Corps pressed eastward, supported by Italian armored divisions like the Ariete, Littorio, and Centauro. These divisions fought valiantly, but the gaps were obvious. Italian tanks lacked radios, night fighting capability, and adequate optics. Many crews had to rely on open hatches just to see the battlefield, exposing themselves to shrapnel and heat. In contrast, the Americans arrived with machines that felt decades ahead. The M4 Sherman, introduced in mid-1942, was the embodiment of reliability. Its 75mm gun could destroy Italian tanks at twice the range. Its engine rarely overheated. Its suspension absorbed the rough desert terrain, and its turret could rotate electrically in seconds. For the Italian tankers, the difference was brutal and immediate. Reports from the Ariete Division after its first encounters described the Sherman as impenetrable from the front and capable of sustained fire at impossible speed. The terrain of North Africa magnified every weakness. The desert was not kind to machinery built for Europe's roads. Italian engines, small diesel units designed for short range, were constantly choked by sand. Crews rationed water not only for themselves, but for cooling radiators. Fuel shortages meant tanks were often abandoned simply to save what little gasoline remained for the Germans. Yet the greatest challenge wasn't mechanical. It was psychological. The Italian tankers knew that the Germans received priority for parts, fuel, and air cover. Axis propaganda portrayed a united front, but within the ranks, frustration simmered. German officers privately criticized Italian equipment, while Italian crews resented being treated as expendable. By mid-1942, battles like Gazala and Bir Hakeim showed glimpses of Italian bravery, but they also revealed systemic collapse. The Ariete Division, Italy's best armored unit, earned respect from both friend and foe for its courage at El Alamein, but courage alone could not compensate for outdated armor. Then came the Americans in full force. The U.S. II Corps, under Major General Lloyd Fredendall, began landing in North Africa as part of Operation Torch in November 1942. The U.S. armored battalions rolled ashore with hundreds of Shermans, Grants, and half-tracks, all equipped with radios, spare parts, and logistics units dedicated solely to maintenance. The contrast was overwhelming. Italian tank crews in Tunisia watched as U.S. columns advanced with precision. Coordinated air cover, artillery spotting, and constant resupply. For Axis forces, every engagement became a battle of survival. The Italian command tried to respond by upgrading their vehicles. They added extra armor plates, fitted some tanks with captured British 2-pounder guns, and improvised sand filters. None of it changed the outcome. Their tanks were still slow, underpowered, and blind in combat. Morale began to crack. Letters from Italian soldiers at the front, many intercepted after the war, spoke of exhaustion and despair. One tanker wrote, "We fight with honor, but our machines betray us. The enemy's tanks are like fortresses, and ours are coffins." As 1942 gave way to 1943, the Axis position in North Africa was collapsing. El Alamein had broken the back of Rommel's offensive. The retreat westward was relentless, through Libya into Tunisia, where battered Italian and German divisions tried to regroup. There, amid the olive groves and rocky hills, the Italian tankers would face their final and most hopeless test against the U.S. Shermans of the Sixth Corps. RT in a place called El Getter. The battle would not only mark the end of Italy's armored ambitions, but also the moment its crews fully understood that bravery alone could not withstand industrial power. The world inside an Italian M1340 was a furnace of noise, heat, and tension. 4 men shared a metal box barely large enough for 3. The engine roared inches from their backs, its vibrations shaking loose bolts from the thin riveted armor. The air smelled of oil, exhaust, and sweat. Each crew member knew his duty by heart. The commander, usually standing half-exposed from the turret, scanned the horizon through dusty optics. The gunner hunched over a 47mm cannon, a weapon once adequate, now nearly useless. The loader balanced shells on his knees, praying none slipped in the chaos. The driver, half-blinded by dust and smoke, guided the lumbering tank through the dunes. Every sound carried meaning. The crack of distant shells, the rattle of machine gun fire, the hum of aircraft above. But the one sound that froze every Italian tanker was metallic. The ricochet of their own shells bouncing harmlessly off enemy armor. That hollow clang meant death was seconds away. Inside, there were no radios. Orders were shouted, sometimes lost entirely under the engine's roar. Many Italian tanks lacked intercoms, forcing crews to bang wrenches on metal to signal directions. When the battle turned chaotic, they fought half-blind, half-deaf, and entirely outmatched. The heat inside reached unbearable levels, over 50 degrees, as the desert sun turned the steel hull into an oven. Crewmen wrapped rags around their hands to touch hot surfaces. Water was rationed, so they drank fuel-flavored condensation from engine pipes. And yet, they fought on. Out of pride, out of brotherhood, out of duty to a homeland that had promised them glory. They watched German panzers maneuver elegantly through the desert, while their own machines groaned and stalled. Still, they pressed forward, shells clinking inside the turret like prayers for survival. For the Italian tankers, battle wasn't just about victory. It was about dignity. Every engagement was a defiance of fate, a struggle to prove they were more than the weaknesses of their machines. But deep down, they knew the truth. No amount of courage could compensate for flawed steel. On paper, the Italian tanks of 1941 looked serviceable. The M13-40 carried a 47mm L-32 gun, 30mm frontal armor, and a top speed of 30 kilometers per hour. But those numbers concealed fatal weaknesses. The riveted armor, instead of welded plating like the Germans used, often became lethal shrapnel when struck. A single enemy hit could cause rivets to shear off internally, turning the cabin into a hail of red-hot metal fragments. The 47mm gun, once effective against early British light tanks, was useless against the Shermans' 75mm thick, sloped armor. Italian shells would shatter or deflect long before reaching penetration range. Crews learned this painfully during combat. Their rounds sparked and bounced, while the Shermans' return fire tore through at 1,800 meters. Mechanically, the M1340's Fiat diesel engine was underpowered and unreliable. Its filters couldn't handle desert dust. Tanks often stalled mid-maneuver, leaving crews stranded targets for Allied gunners. The electrical systems short-circuited from sand and heat. By contrast, the American M4 Sherman was a masterpiece of practicality. Its radial engine could endure weeks of operation without breakdown. Its sloped armor deflected hits more efficiently than the thicker but flat armor of Axis tanks, and it could traverse its turret electrically, a small advantage that, in combat, meant life or death. Where Italian tanks carried only a few armor-piercing rounds, Shermans carried dozens, each precisely manufactured. The Americans used stabilized guns, allowing them to fire accurately even while moving, a tie-D concept the Italians hadn't even considered. Italian commanders requested upgrades throughout. 1941-42, designers proposed the P-2640, a heavier tank that might compete with Allied models. But bureaucratic delays, material shortages, and Mussolini's overconfidence delayed production. By the time it entered service in 1943, Italy's North African campaign was already lost. This technological inferiority wasn't just a matter of poor design, it was industrial destiny. Italy lacked the steel output, the foundries, and the assembly lines that powered American and German war machines. The few tanks they did produce had to be shipped across the Mediterranean under constant threat of Allied aircraft and submarines. Many never reached Africa at all. For the Italian tankers on the front, this meant entering battle already defeated by engineering. They could repair, adapt, and improvise, but they could not change physics. Their guns couldn't penetrate. Their engines couldn't run. Their armor couldn't hold. One German officer summed it up bluntly. "They are brave men, but their machines belong to another war." The truth was undeniable. The Italians had entered the most mechanized conflict in history with weapons designed for colonial skirmishes. Every engagement was a lesson in obsolescence, and every defeat a reminder that courage, without steel, was helpless. The stage was now set for the psychological and tactical unraveling that would follow. Moments when even the bravest crews began to realize that survival itself was becoming impossible. In theory, Italian tank divisions were meant to fight as modern, mobile spearheads, armored columns punching through enemy lines in coordination with artillery and air support. In practice, the reality was far more chaotic. Communication was the greatest weakness. Most Italian tanks carried no radios. Orders were relayed by colored flags, hand gestures, or motorcycle couriers weaving through dust clouds and shell fire. In the chaos of battle, such methods collapsed instantly. While German and American tank commanders coordinated platoon maneuvers in seconds, Italian units often advanced blindly, unable to adapt once the shooting started. At El Alamein, these flaws became fatal. Italian tankers found themselves supporting German panzers without even knowing their positions. When the Germans pulled back or changed formation, Italian crews were left exposed. Their tanks were slower, their optics inferior, and their armor thin. Many were destroyed before firing a single shot. Even so, Italian commanders tried to adapt. They began using small groups of tanks in ambush positions, hiding behind dunes or rock outcrops until the enemy came close. This tactic worked briefly, until the Americans arrived with reconnaissance planes and well-coordinated artillery. The Shermans could stand off at a kilometer and destroy Italian tanks before they were even seen. Terrain played its role as well. The desert, vast and deceptive, punished anyone who moved without planning. Shermans glided over sand thanks to wide tracks and powerful engines. Italian tanks bogged down easily. Many were lost not to enemy fire, but to mechanical breakdowns and overheating. Rommel's reports to Berlin frequently praised Italian bravery, but lamented their equipment. He once remarked, "They fight with courage, but courage alone cannot move broken machines." As 1942 turned to 1943, the tactical map became a graveyard of Italian armor. At Marath, Kasserine, and El Guitar, they faced a new kind of war. One defined by mobility, radio coordination, and overwhelming firepower. The Italian tankers entered each fight with the same determination, but their tactical world belonged to another decade. Every war has a moment when soldiers realize the outcome is beyond them. For the Italian tankers, that realization came not through surrender, but through repetition, the endless cycle of defeat that no bravery could alter. At first, they clung to hope. They told themselves the Germans would send better tanks, that reinforcements were on the way. They watched propaganda films claiming Italian armor was improving. But after each battle, fewer tanks returned. The wrecks littering the desert told a different story. Melted hulls, open hatches, the blackened silhouettes of once proud machines. The sense of futility grew with each encounter against the Americans. The Sherman was not just another tank. It was a symbol of an industrial civilization at full stride. When Italian rounds ricocheted harmlessly off its armor, crews felt the weight of inevitability. They weren't just losing a battle. They were losing a century. Many began to feel abandoned. Letters home, later recovered from battlefields, described a quiet despair. We fight with courage, but we are forgotten by those who send us here. Among officers, morale collapsed more slowly, but no less deeply. Reports to headquarters became desperate appeals for help. New parts, new tanks, anything. Few answers came. Mussolini's government in Rome still spoke of victory, while men in the desert spoke only of survival. German soldiers, too, noticed the change. They admired the Italians' endurance but pitied their circumstances. A German tanker at El Guetar later recalled, "They stood their ground when anyone else would have fled. Their tanks burned, but they stayed inside until the end." Courage had become a quiet tragedy. Bravery without hope. By early 1943, the Italian tankers no longer feared the enemy as much as they feared being forgotten. The Shermans they faced were faster, stronger, and endless. Every destroyed Italian tank was simply replaced by another American machine. Fresh paint, clean tracks, the hum of confidence in every engine. The Italian soldiers had no such luxury. Their machines aged daily, their armor grew thinner with every hit, and their guns seemed smaller each time they fired. The will to fight remained, but the belief in victory had vanished. From the American side, the encounters with Italian armor were often one-sided, but not without respect. U.S. crews noted how stubbornly the Italians fought, despite their outdated equipment. After the war, Many veterans described the Italian tankers as fearless but doomed. An American Sherman commander who fought near Magnesy wrote in his diary, "They kept coming even when they had no chance. I saw one M13 roll straight into our fire. No smoke, no hesitation. They fought like men who knew they wouldn't win." To the Americans, it was a strange battle. Fighting men who shared their courage, but not their tools. The Sherman crews faced mechanical challenges of their own. Engines catching fire, cramped interiors, but compared to the Italians, they lived in another world. Their radios worked. Their shells penetrated. Their tanks came in endless numbers. U.S. units quickly learned that Italian tanks posed little direct threat, but they treated them seriously out of respect for the men inside them. American officers often briefed their troops, "Don't underestimate the Italians. Their tanks are weak, not their hearts." In the aftermath of these battles, Allied soldiers frequently shared water and cigarettes with captured Italian crews. There was no hatred, only the unspoken understanding of men caught in a machine larger than themselves. To the victors, the Italian tanks symbolized courage undone by neglect. To the survivors, they were tombs of forgotten promises. The human, technological, and moral weight of these encounters now converged toward one place. The battle that would define this imbalance once and for all. That place was El Guetter, Tunisia, 1943, Tunisia, March 23, 1943. The Battle of El Guetter. The morning began with silence. A pale desert sun crept over the ridgelines as the Italian Centauro armored division and remnants of the Ariete regrouped alongside their German allies. Their orders were simple. Hold the line against the advancing Americans of General George S. Patton's Second Corps. But nothing about the situation was simple. The Italians knew what awaited them. Across the dry wadi and broken hills, the U.S. Army had assembled hundreds of Shermans, Grants, and anti-tank guns. Their artillery blanketed the valleys with precision. American air patrols droned overhead, unchallenged. For the Axis tankers, every movement was observed, every puff of dust a target. Still, the Italian tank commanders climbed into their M1441s, sealing the hatches with the quiet resignation of men walking into a storm. Orders came through from the German liaison. Advance! Engage! At 07:30 hours, engines roared to life. The Italian columns began to roll forward, treads grinding the sand. Dust clouds rose high, revealing their position almost instantly. American spotters saw the movement and relayed coordinates. Within minutes, the first U.S. shells began to fall. The earth erupted. Shells rained down on the Italian formation, tearing through the thin armor of the lead tanks. 2 M14s went up in flames before firing a single shot. The survivors pressed on, closing the distance in desperate defiance. Their 47mm guns opened fire. Bright flashes, sharp reports echoing across the desert. The shells bounced. From behind the ridges, Shermans returned fire methodically, their 75mm cannons booming in unison. Each hit was devastating. Italian tanks shattered like tin, fragments scattering across the dunes. The coordination was perfect. One American platoon covering another, advancing under artillery support, guided by radio precision. Italian crews had no such advantage. Inside their tanks, commanders shouted over the noise, banging fists on metal to signal maneuvers. Smoke filled the interiors, choking the crews. Visibility dropped to nothing. Some fired blind, others tried to flank, only to be cut down by American guns waiting in ambush. The battle descended into chaos. At the center of the field, a group of Italian M14s tried a counterattack, swinging wide through a shallow ravine to strike the Shermans from the side. For a moment, they succeeded. 2 Shermans were hit, one immobilized. But the triumph was short-lived. A wave of American tanks appeared over the ridge, flanking them completely. The Italian formation disintegrated under the weight of superior numbers. German panzers attempted to intervene, but were too few. The Italian crews kept fighting, often refusing to retreat even when surrounded. One U.S. observer later noted, "They didn't run, they burned where they stood." By mid-morning, the battlefield was a sea of smoke and wreckage. Dozens of Italian tanks lay gutted, some with their turrets blown clean off. The stench of burning oil mixed with the acrid smell of cordite. Across the radio channels, American units reported minimal losses. For the Italian tankers still alive, the horror was beyond words. Many watched shells strike their comrades' tanks. Silent flashes followed by black fire. The survivors fought on in futility, some bailing out only to be cut down by strafing aircraft. Others remained inside, preferring death to capture. At 10:30 hours, the order finally came. Retreat. But retreat was impossible. Engines were failing, tracks were shattered, and the road back was already under artillery fire. The last operational Italian tank on the left flank continued firing until its ammunition was gone. When American infantry closed in, they found the crew dead at their posts, the commander still gripping the hand crank of the turret. By noon, the battle was over. The once proud Centauro Division had ceased to exist as an armored force. Out of nearly 70 Italian tanks that began the assault, fewer than 10 remained functional. The ground was littered with twisted metal, ammunition boxes, and the blackened remains of courage. For the U.S. soldiers advancing through the wreckage, the sight was both awe-inspiring and somber. The Italians had fought bravely, but their tanks had stood no chance. The Battle of El Gueter marked more than just another Allied victory. It was the symbolic end of Italy's armored war. From that day on, Italian tankers knew that their machines, their doctrine, and their dreams of mechanized glory were finished. In the smoldering silence that followed, one truth echoed louder than the guns: the age of the Italian tank had ended in fire. Italy, September 1943, the fall of Mussolini, and the collapse of the Italian war machine. When news broke that Mussolini had been arrested and Italy was negotiating an armistice with the Allies, the reaction inside Italian armored units was chaos. Some cheered, believing the nightmare was finally ending. Others stood in stunned silence, knowing that betrayal meant only one thing: Germany would never forgive them. For the Italian tankers, the enemy was no longer just the Allies. Overnight, the battlefield turned inside out. German troops, once their brothers in arms, were now storming Italian bases, seizing weapons, and executing officers who refused to surrender. The Italian army fractured. Some swore loyalty to the new Italian Social Republic under Mussolini's puppet regime in the north, while others laid down their arms or joined the partisans, but a few armored units refused to vanish quietly. In Lombardy, the remnants of the Ariete Setu division regrouped, desperate to defend their homeland from all sides. Their tanks, a patchwork of surviving M15 Tatar 42s, old Semovente 75 Arcard 18s, and captured German vehicles, represented a dying breed of warriors. Their machines were obsolete, their supplies dwindling, but they clung to duty like men clinging to identity itself. The roads of Italy were now choked with confusion. German convoys heading south to counter the Allied invasion at Salerno, Italian columns moving in every direction, unsure of their orders. In this chaos, a confrontation was inevitable. At dawn, near Piacenza, a German armored detachment from the 26th Panzer Division intercepted an Italian tank column attempting to withdraw. The German commander ordered them to disarm. The Italian officer, Captain Ricci of the Ariete, refused. There was a long silence. Then, engines roared. The firefight was brief and brutal. German Panthers and Panzer IVs tore through the Italian column with clinical precision. The M15s returned fire, but their shells sparked uselessly against the Panther's armor. Within minutes, the Italian resistance was crushed. Survivors were rounded up, some executed on the spot. Ricci's last words, as recorded by a nearby villager, were, "We fought with honor, not with hate." Across the peninsula, scenes like this repeated again and again. Italian tankers, who had once fought beside the Germans in North Africa, were now hunted by them. Depots were looted, factories seized, and tank production redirected to the German war effort. But even in defeat, the Italians continued to resist. Small groups of tank crews joined partisan forces, sabotaging rail lines and ambushing German convoys in the mountains. Their tanks were gone, but their resolve had hardened. Meanwhile, in southern Italy, Italian armored vehicles were now fighting for the Allies. A bitter irony. At Salerno and later at Anzio, Italian crews who had switched sides drove their semovente assault guns in support of British infantry. Their loyalty had shifted, but the war showed no mercy. Many of them died under the same Allied artillery that once targeted them. The Italian peninsula had become a graveyard of armor. Burned-out hulls littering the roads from Naples to Bologna. Some were marked with German crosses, others with Italian tricolors, still others defaced or abandoned. It was as if the land itself was swallowing the remnants of a broken dream. For the German High Command, Italian armor was a tool to be exploited. For the Allies, it was a curiosity. But for the men who had once called those tanks home, who had lived, fought, and burned inside them, it was the end of everything they believed in. One surviving tanker from the Littorio Division later wrote in his memoir, "When the Germans turned their guns on us, I understood that the war was never about nations or flags. It was about survival, and for us, there was none left to find." By the end of 1943, the Italian Armored Corps had ceased to exist as an organized force. The factories in Turin and Genoa were now under German control, producing vehicles for the Wehrmacht. Italian designs, once ridiculed by their enemies, were stripped for parts and engineering insights, a final indignity to a once proud military tradition. Yet, amidst the ruins, there was a strange sense of closure. For the Italian tankers who survived North Africa, El Alamein, and now the fall of their homeland, the war had come full circle. They had entered it under the blazing sun of Libya, dreaming of empire, and ended it fighting in their own burning cities, defending nothing but the last fragments of honor. The tanks that once rolled with Mussolini's ambitions were now rusting relics, consumed by the same fire they had unleashed across the Mediterranean. And for those who lived to tell the tale, one memory lingered above all: the hum of an underpowered engine, the smell of diesel and sand, and the haunting echo of shells that never pierced the enemy. Their courage was undeniable, but courage alone had never been enough. In the decades that followed the war, the image of the Italian tank, small, underpowered, often burning in the desert, became a symbol of failure. Military historians wrote of the Italian armored tragedy, comparing their tanks unfavorably to the German Panthers or American Shermans. But beneath those cold statistics, there was something deeper. A story of courage drowned beneath the weight of industrial imbalance and political delusion. The men who fought inside those steel coffins did not choose their machines, nor the wars they were sent to fight. They climbed into them because duty demanded it. They fought because someone had to. After 1945, Italy was in ruins. The factories that once built tanks were silent, their machinery dismantled, their engineers scattered. Fiat and Ansaldo, once pillars of fascist industry, shifted to rebuilding a nation rather than an empire. The M13s, M14s, and semoventes that had defined Italian armored warfare became scrap metal or museum pieces. But for those who had lived inside them, Each rivet and gear held a story. In the early post-war years, surviving tankers gathered in quiet reunions. Men who had fought in Libya, Egypt, Tunisia. Men who had seen the desert swallow their comrades whole. They spoke softly of courage, not of glory. Of survival, not victory. One veteran of the Ariete Division said in 1957, "They call us the weak, the ones who failed. But we faced the impossible and still went forward. That was our victory." And in a way, he was right. Italy had entered the war dreaming of empire but lacking the means to wage modern war. Its armored divisions were built on outdated designs, thin armor, and wishful thinking. Yet its tankers fought with remarkable spirit, not because they believed in Mussolini's vision, but because they believed in each other. The Allied commanders who faced them often acknowledged this paradox. British after-action reports from North Africa noted that Italian crews fought stubbornly, even when hopelessly outgunned. American officers in Tunisia reported capturing Italian tanks abandoned only after sustaining catastrophic damage. It was not cowardice that doomed the Italian armored forces. It was circumstance, a nation trying to wage a 20th century war with 19th century resources. The M1340, the most common Italian tank of the early war, was an embodiment of that contradiction. It was slow, cramped, and thinly armored, yet it was produced with care and mechanical precision. Its 47mm gun was lethal in 1940, useless by 1942. Its crews learned this the hard way, watching their shells bounce off British Grants or American Shermans. By contrast, the Sherman represented everything Italy lacked: mass production, engineering standardization, and logistical foresight. Where Italy built hundreds, America built tens of thousands. It wasn't just about better steel. It was about a system that could replace every loss tenfold. That was the real imbalance of the war. Not courage, but capacity. When Italian engineers later studied captured Shermans after the war, they marveled not at the armor or gun, but at the simplicity, the transmission, the cooling system, the ease of repair. All designed for soldiers, not engineers. The Sherman wasn't perfect, but it was human-centered, made to survive a war of attrition. The Italian tankers never had that luxury. Every breakdown was a battle. Every shot fired was a gamble. And yet, in a strange way, their struggle was not in vain. The lessons they paid for in blood reshaped Italy's post-war military philosophy. When the new Italian Republic joined NATO in 1949, its armored forces were rebuilt from the ground up. This time, Italy focused on interoperability, reliability, and quality control. By the 1960s, Italian engineers were co-developing the Leopard, and later producing advanced domestic designs like the Ariete, MBT, a name deliberately chosen to honor the heroic division that had fallen at El Alamein. The Ariete tank of the modern Italian army bears no resemblance to its fragile ancestors. It is powerful, modern, and efficient, a symbol not of empire, but of redemption. In military museums across Rome, Turin, and Piana delle Orme, the rusted hulks of the old M13s and Semoventes sit silently beneath the weight of memory. Visitors walk past them, unaware of the sweat and fear that once filled their cramped interiors. Yet, for those who know, for those who remember, those machines speak volumes. They tell of young men who fought not for conquest, but for survival. They tell of courage measured not in victories, but in endurance. And they remind us that history's losers often carry its most human stories. The Italian tankers did not win their battles, but they fought them with everything they had, in machines that were never meant to win. When historians look back on the desert wars of North Africa, they see strategy and technology. But if you listen closely, Beneath the roar of engines and the clash of nations, you can still hear something quieter. The heartbeat of men trapped in impossible circumstances, still refusing to surrender. That is their legacy. A legacy not of triumph, but of defiance. Not of conquest, but of courage. And though their tanks burned under the same sun that once promised glory, their story endures, a reminder that even in defeat, there is dignity, because in the end, it was never just about the machines. It was about the men inside them.